Howdy, all you delicious people, and here to debut next from 2007. So, this movie reminds me of all those kind of manhunt movies, like the Harrison Ford music movie Fugitive, or it's to also remind me of movies like Firestarter or Starman, with a character with a special ability that he uses to avoid uh, trying to get caught by all these security or agents or just villains in this film. So we have Chris that can see 2 minutes ahead of time into the future, but it only really has to affect him. And so these agents are trying to talk to Chris to have his abilities get used so they can find this bomb that had gotten missing by the Russian Federation. And so Chris is to really not want to get involved with that mission because he realizes that his ability won't quite work with what they need. And so the more and more that Chris tries to avoid these agents at all costs, the more he is forced to realize that he has to work with them because they just won't go away. And also, Chris is realizing that he is to really be a guy that is to have nothing better to do besides getting with the woman that he is to possibly feel is the one, or that he will be spending the rest of whatever is to be his life with this woman. And so having us possibly think if they were to probably do a sequel, that the relationship between Liz and Chris probably would not have worked out, I feel. But so, speaking of the way that they kind of set up this movie, a lot of people could probably complain about the ending, on how, like, the ending, it feels, was possibly set up for a sequel that they never did. But it kind of feels like this movie is kind of left unfinished. And so people could probably not have liked that. I honestly just had a lot of fun with this movie. I really did like it. I thought that it was an okay or solid okay movie. I know right now that Next is available on Cinemax, but I can go on and tell you that there is an app called Culnisgol, Culnissgol. Culnisgol. Hopefully I'm spelling that right. And you can see Next and a number of other things for absolutely free. And I actually would recommend this movie. We have Nicolas Cage, who is playing a magician, and he's doing all these tricks. And we also have a point in this movie that I thought was rather weird, as if something had gotten lost in, like, the cutting room floor for time or whatever. But we had one scene, and I'm kind of curious if maybe, like, Nicolas Cage did a lot of ad-libbing in most of this movie or not. But we had Chris that talks about needing to meet up with this shaman in this movie, and you never see that in the film. As if they had spent so much time talking about this, but they went nowhere with it in the film. And I was like, what happened there? Plus, also, like, the pacing of this film really does slow down, because when I was to be in this movie watching it, and I was thinking, like, man, like, they got a lot of stuff done in this movie, and I'd be thinking that I'd be like an hour in by now, and I look at the timestamp and I'm like, oh my god, we are only 30 minutes in. Oh my god, there's a lot going on in this film. And there is also certain times where Chris has to re-explain his ability to certain people. And that does kind of become annoying to have to kind of go on and kind of redo or re-explain or whatever. But also, there are certain times where Chris would do like all of this work to then realize he had made one small mistake, and then he would have to backpedal, and he would have to redo a whole bunch of like. So I'm like, man, you could have kind of cut this a little bit differently, but either way, some of the extra stuff is good, and then some of it's bad. Um, I of course like the part where Chris goes on and first meets up with Liz, and we have him like trying all these kind of things to get with her, and that of course would seem like the 50 First Dates Adam Sandler movie, where we desperately have Adam Sandler who is to like fake that he can't read to try to get with Drew Barrymore's character, and that could also 50 First Dates feel like a repeated day movie also. But so with that said, let's go on and let's just double five this bad boy up, because it's about that time to, of course, go into a lot of this movie. There's a lot of ground to cover in this film. So, with that said, hopefully I'm going to go on and talk about this film the best way I can. So, check out this movie on an app called Culnisgol if I haven't already said that already. Culnissgol. Culnisgol. You can see this movie for free, as well as a number of other movies and shows that I've possibly reviewed recently here. And by all means, just go on and hopefully enjoy this film like I actually did. I thought it was a solid okay film. So with that said, let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time is about the time I spoil this movie. I didn't do the countdown this time around. So the beginning of the film starts with Chris that waits at this diner at 8:09 every day, twice a day, for this woman to show up. And so Chris somehow was to have gone on and seen well past the 2 minutes, knowing that this girl at some point will show up. And so Chris goes to this diner waiting for this woman, and we even have a point where, like, when Irv talks to Chris, it's like, well, hey, like, did you go on and, like, look at a calendar when you were seeing this vision of this girl, besides, like, looking at the clock? Because, man, what happens if, like, you're waiting at this diner for, like, 10 years? Like, you're wasting your life to get to this one girl. And so, like, what if she, like, never really comes for you? And Chris is like, well, like, she already did. So, but yeah, so let's go on. So we transition to backstage at Chris's magic trick gig. We all of a sudden have a woman who's adjusting herself, and I'm like, yeah, like, that's showbiz for you. So we have Chris, who is to take the stage, and he is to go by a stage name named Frank Cadillac. We'll find out in the movie that the reason for that being is that Chris, of course, wanted to choose a stage name that combined his two favorite things, Frankenstein and Cadillac. So I was like, okay, that is kind of a fun idea. So, plus also, like, Chris needs a stage name anyways, because, like, if someone was to kind of figure it out, like, that he has this psych ability, so he has this kind of stage name he can go under. So anyways, so we have Chris that all of a sudden has like doves flying out of his sleeves, and we have all of a sudden that Chris walks up to a man in the audience and is to say, it's like, well, hey, sir, like, where are you from? Wait, don't tell me. Like, I'm having a feeling that you have, like, soul in you. And so we of course have the man ask where he's from, and he states that he's from Korea. Of course, if people don't know, there is actually a place in Korea that is to be called Seoul. And I only know that because, of course, I've seen a animated version of Train to Busan where I think that movie was to be called like Seoul, Korea, or something like that, or something along those lines. So if I'm wrong about that, I'm sorry, or maybe I'm pronouncing that wrong. But so we have after that, we have Chris who is to see a woman sitting next to this man, and he's like, "Oh, hey, like, who are you?" And she ends up saying that she's young. She's young, and so we have Chris who's like, "Oh, okay, well, how about you come up to the stage? Because I have a feeling that your necklace is going to fall soon, because the way it's set up, it's going to fall." And like Chris perfectly times it to where the necklace is to fall and it lands in her drink. We all of a sudden have, of course, the woman that doesn't even realize that her necklace is missing from out of this drink. And so Chris is like, well, hey, like, look into the back of my coat. And so she looks into it like, oh, here's my necklace. So we have Callie and Kavanaugh who are in the audience, and we have Kavanaugh that's like, really, like, this is the guy that you want us to work with? Like, could we hire a clown, or is there any other like Vegas show that you want to like have hired here? So could we have gone on and find the characters from the Chris Evans movie Push instead? So Kavanaugh is second guessing, but Callie really wants this guy. And so Chris goes after his show is to be over to head to the casino, and because like what he gets paid on his gig like doesn't pay out really well, so he decides to go on and is to make his way to this casino where he can gamble a little bit. So while he's transitioning to this, we have him talk about how there is to be some actual people who are the real deal that are actually masquerading as an act. And if anyone was to have like realized that like this person was the real deal, like people could not handle the real truth. So we have Chris that is gambling because his act doesn't pay well. Chris has to minimize his winnings because, of course, there's like no mega jackpots. So he can just kind of fly under the radar, and nobody can like have suspicions that Chris is like counting cards or doing something illegal. So he can just kind of keep coming back to the casino. So and keep on kind of winning. So we have these security guys that are looking into Chris, and so we have these security guards that are thinking, it's like, well, like there has to be some kind of trick deck, or he's card counting, and so they're looking at Chris like, well, yeah, he must be doing something. And they remember he played as that magician, and so like, yeah, like we remember this guy. So we also have them very concerned that, like, Chris, if he kind of knows something, like, why is he bidding so low? Like, why wouldn't he, like, go all in, or, like, why wouldn't he? So yeah, like, Chris is doing something very unusual. So Chris all of a sudden just looked directly at the camera, right into, like, the eye of these guys, and, like, does he know that we're talking about him? Like, man, this guy is really weird. And so we have the security who's like, okay, like, let's start to look into this guy. Like, he walkies and starts to get things rolling. And so Chris walks off to try and cash in his chips. So Chris is to mention that every time you look into the future, it changes because you look at it. So a man is standing next to Chris, and he whips out this gun and holds up this casino, and he gets all this money, and he shoots the security guard, and he also shoots the cashier. And then we find that this repeats, and so Chris tackles the robber and takes the gun out of his hand, and Chris is to completely stop this guy from robbing this place. But then Chris has this gun in his hand, and the security guards come in and they want to arrest Chris because they're thinking that, like, hey, like, you have a gun in your hand, you're doing something illegal. But Chris is trying to convince them, like, well, hey, I tried to stop him from robbing your casino, and he tried to do a good deed, but, like, no good deed goes, like, unpunished. So even when Chris is trying to explain any of this, like, the guys are wanting to just arrest Chris because he has a gun in his hand. And we even have the security guy that states, like, oh yeah, like, Chris was waving the gun around. Yeah, I'm sure he was waving the gun around. So Chris immediately just starts walking off and starts hiding himself to where the security can't see him. So we have the security who are making all these calls, like, well, hey, he's right in between you. Hey, he's right there. So Chris goes to the men's room and throws away his shirt and is to grab this guy's hat. And so Chris slips away from everybody because they now don't know what he looks like. And so Chris goes off to just commandeer this car that is being valeted, and Chris drives off with it, and we now have a chase going on with the police. So Chris is to speed up his car, but not enough. And so his car ends up getting hit by a train. So we're back again to Chris being chased by this police. And so Chris speeds up his car to completely avoid this train. So Callie is to tell the NSA director Wisdom about Chris being their wish list for trying to catch this guy for gambling fraud, and that he knows everything that he can do to not get caught, because of course that is to be his kind of like weird kind of catchphrase where it's like he knows everything before you tell him, kind of thing. So we have Wisdom that goes on to mention that they have more important cases instead of just some paranormal magician that they're needing to chase after. And so he is to mention about a missing bomb taken 5 weeks ago from the Russian Federation, and he wants actual intelligence instead of BS paranormal magicians. So Callie tells Wisdom that Chris has a pattern of advanced awareness that's impossible, and if he could be brought in, they could solve the case. So, Wisdom gives Callie 5 days to track down Chris, and so Callie wants the casino security called. So Kavanaugh talks to one of the security men called Roybal. So we then transition to Chris dropping off a stolen car to Irv, who a lot of people probably know as Columbo, or bizarrely, you would see him in kind of like random movies every once in a while, but I know him as Columbo. A lot of people might not even know who Columbo is. He, of course, was a really cool like detective that would always go on and kind of overly question certain people to the point of them getting so annoyed with Columbo, but then by the end of the show, he'd be like, "Well, yeah, I figured it all out, and here's how." Columbo would be what kind of Monk kind of became. So yeah, so if people know what Monk is, then they'll probably know what Columbo is. So anyways, uh, either way, people probably be like, "What the heck are you talking about, Columbo, Monk? I don't know what you're talking about." So we have Chris that is to give Irv supposedly sandwiches, but instead it's to be tons of money that equals to 20 grand. So Roybal talks to Callie and about Chris Johnson, and so like she has to jog his memory of who this guy is. Like, well, he also goes by Frank Cadillac. So we have Roybal that says that Chris tackled a guy and was giving a gun a wave, and so Callie, of course, tells Roybal, it's like, well, hey, the guy that he tackled had gone on to rob two casinos before, so yeah, so he went on and did something that you couldn't. So Callie points out to Roybal the point when he was to look, Chris was to look at the camera, and so Roybal was like, yeah, like we thought that he was looking at us. That uh and we at that point were like asking between one another like why he wasn't betting more and if he like knows the system. So Calivan tells Roybal that he should forget what he like said and talked about here, and that they're going to go on and take all of his camera footage and delete all of it, and like just have him forget that Chris Johnson never existed. So Chris is shaving his face, and Irv tells him he needs to stop stealing cars and forget about that girl that won't show up at that diner. And so Chris convinces Irv that she already did show up at that diner at 8:09. Irv mentions like, well, hey, how about we just kind of play pool, like we have a couple of hours to kill before you go to this diner, hopefully finding this woman there finally. So Callie realizes a minute and a half is the longest Chris can see ahead of time, it seems, for her. And we also have another agent that states that well, yeah, once it gets past like 2 minutes and change, like we start to have like Chris that kind of gives up and kind of walks away. So Kavanaugh is to track down the LoJack car that Chris stole, is to figure out where Chris possibly is. So Irv tells Chris that it could take 10 years until he has that woman come to that diner, because we again would not have Chris have looked into a calendar as well as seeing the time that this girl shows up. So we have Chris that says, like, well, hey, it must be soon, because normally Chris doesn't see 2 minutes beyond normally. So Chris feels the woman may be the one, as he knows Callie is coming for him also. And Irv says, like, you need to leave, but Chris is like, wait a minute, I want to see what she knows. And then I'll decide whether or not I want to leave. And I also want to figure out, like, why she is tracking me down. So Callie meets up with Chris and is to remind him about the first time that they were both together at that show. And Callie ends up bringing up about the bomb that's being smuggled into the U.S. and wants Chris to look ahead to find out where the bomb will be deployed. So Chris mentions that what he does is a magic act, and so Callie mentions to Chris that it's like, well, like, now getting much more practical, it's like, we are in the presence of a stolen car, and you're wanted for assault involving a weapon, so, like, I can kind of take you in, and so, hey, if you want to work off that prison sentence, might as well work with me. So Chris said that he was to have gone on and saved people by doing what he did, and so we have Callie that says, like, well, how did you know that? Like, and she starts to say, it's like, well, no good deed goes unpunished. So Chris is to talk about the times of which that people were to state that they were helping him, but really they were actually torturing him. Talking about observed play therapy and flashcard games, where he would have to spend hours upon hours having the people guess what card they had. It was kind of course, like the first Ghostbusters movie, where Bill Murray is kind of like, hey, what card do I have? And the girl is supposedly to be right on every single time, but then the kid isn't, even if he does get one right, which was the Wavy Lines card. So Callie will force him to work with them, and so Chris realizes he needs to escape before Callie even gets to this area, because he has rolled back time, and so he's like, oh, I need to get out of here. Like, no matter what I tell this woman, like, she won't get that my ability won't work for her. So Callie talks to Irv. It's like, well, I must have missed him by seconds. And so we have Roybal that has a couple sitting on his car, and come to find out, the couple is from the Gaming Commission, and they talk about Chris Johnson. Come to find out, these two people are to actually be the bad guy here. We have the guy who is actually Mr. Smith, and I don't know who the girl really is. But so The two of them are going on, and they're wanting to torture this guy for information. They go on to shoot his knees, and then once they get the information that they get out of him, they slice his throat. So Chris waits at the diner to finally see the girl he's been looking for all this time, Liz, who of course is Jessica Biel. Which I was like, yeah, like, okay, like, I really liked what they did with Jessica Biel in this movie. Man, did they give her a lot of lines, but still, uh, like, I really liked how they worked her into this film. It was really good, I think. So, Chris comes up with a number of excuses to try and talk to Liz, and nothing really works. So, we have him at some point who he tries to talk about like the beans for the coffee, and Liz is like, well, shouldn't you be talking to your waitress about this? And he tries to go on over and asks her about like, well, hey, can I borrow a cigarette, or could I borrow a light? And she's like, oh, I'm sorry, I don't smoke. And so the further and further that he tries to get uh next to her, even like, well, hey, like, it seems like you're sitting alone, can I sit here too? And Liz is just like, oh no, I'm sorry. So everything that Chris tries to, it doesn't work. Even when he tries to like get up, Liz is like, no, like, don't come over here. So we have all of a sudden this guy come in who's Kendall. So Kendall comes into this diner as Liz's possible stalker, which the guy who actually plays Kendall, I like this actor. I've kind of seen him in like a random number of things. At one point, I saw him in the movie Wishmaster, which I was like, man, like, this guy's really good. This guy's really good. But I'd also seen him on like Big Bang Theory and just kind of random things. I know he was on like Battlestar Galactica, but I've never really seen that show. So we have more and more that Kendall is like grabbing onto Liz's arm, and like more and more like I've tried to follow you here, I've tried to follow you there, and like, why can't we just make this work? So Chris is to touch Kendall by the shoulder and tell him that he's having an off day, and that Chris is to be Liz's future. And we start to have Kendall start swinging, and we of course have Chris who dodges every single punch. And we have Chris that starts to introduce himself to Liz and states that, like, well, you know what, like, there's something about the two of us, and I feel just strangely connected to you. And so after like Chris dodges all these punches, he then goes on to take Kendall and positions him in a way that he's kind of leaning over, and so we have Chris who's to take these coins and kind of have them fall and make it look like Kendall is paying for this meal. And we of course have Chris who tells Liz to, like, hey, try the pie. So Liz is to not be satisfied by this whole like macho thing, and Liz is to want to just kind of pay for her own meal, and so she leaves. And then Chris is like, man, that didn't work either. So Chris is to again go on and touch the shoulder of Kendall, and is to kind of repeat the, like, well, hey, like, who are you? Like, I'm Liz's future. And so we have Chris who eats Kendall's punch and he falls over. So that finally works with Liz to where she like is to try to take care of Chris and kind of shoo Kendall away to where Kendall just runs off. So it honestly would have been really fascinating if we would have found out later that Kendall was somehow involved in the whole villain side of things, and that would have had like this strange connection where maybe Chris had to feel more like it was destined for him to be more involved in the Callie situation because like Liz was somehow connected to it. But so strange coincidence, but that didn't work out that way in the film. So we have Liz who's just kind of taking care of Chris, and so Chris is to tell Liz that hey, your luck will change. Like I know that your luck will change. And Liz is like, well, who are you? Are you some leprechaun? And Chris is to be like, well, like, do leprechauns get punched in the face and have their car be stolen? And Liz is like, oh, like your car is stolen? And so we have Chris that talks about that he needs to go to Flagstaff. And Liz is like, oh, really? That's where I'm going. So we have Liz that's like, well, hey, like if we're both going to the same like location, how about I go on and just kind of let you like drive along with me, like as long as you're not gonna give any like psycho vibes, because if immediately you give me any psycho vibes, I'm kicking you out of my car. So we have Chris and Liz that are kind of driving off to Flagstaff. And so Chris is all of a sudden mentioning about destiny, and Liz is getting a little bit of those psycho vibes. Chris acts as if he's, or Chris acts if she, or Chris asks like, well, hey, you don't believe in destiny, right? And so Liz doesn't want anything to be predetermined. She just wants everything to be kind of like a surprise in life, like a happy coincidence or whatever. So Callie goes to the diner and is to ask people that work there if they were to see Chris or like did he leave with anybody and so on and so forth. So we have the people kind of talking about all the weird people that they have at this place. And the worker or the worker notices that he came at the same time every day, and Callie asks if they had cameras anywhere, and that of course is a no. And the worker had, or the waitress had overheard that they were going to Flagstaff, and so Callie tells Kavanaugh that they have some security cameras that are nearby this location that are kind of looking out, and so it's like, well, hey, go on and get to those certain businesses and ask for their cameras. So we have Kavanaugh that goes on to mention about Roy Ball, who had gotten shot and his throat cut. And so Callie asks why he didn't give her any of that information before. And so she states, like, well, next time, like, tell me, like, any bit of information, no matter how minute it may seem. So we then go on to have Mr. Smith, who is the game commissioner, and he is watching on as this ship is to be delivering this crate that has this finishing piece of this bomb that they are inserting within this bomb. And so Mr. Smith was asked about Roy Ball and how he complained about a woman, or complained like a woman, even though he was to be a very macho like guy. So it seems that on the villain side of things, they had found out about Chris and that they haven't uh, found him yet, for Callie to have not have found him yet. So they're talking about how weird it is that this guy can possibly see the future. And so Mr. Jones tells Smith that they spent 2 years on this mission and they don't want Chris messing it all up for them, uh, and ruining their progress. So since the authorities are looking for Chris, then they need to look into Chris. So Liv and Chris end up at a canyon, and Liz is to have worked at this place, and that is to also not only be a canyon but also a reservation, and she used to teach there. So Chris wants to meet up with the shaman, and that's the whole thing that I was talking about before, because really, I was like, they never went anywhere with this. But so, the shaman may not only be a healer, but has powers over the atmosphere and can see into the future. So, Liz has a birthday bag for a student that she, of course, had taught at some point, but is to probably not be someone that Liz teaches now, because she's no longer on the reservation. So, why did I even state that? So, Liz talks to a group of kids, and they ask about Chris because he's looking at Liz like other boys would look at their girlfriends. So, Chris does this magic trick for Jake, who is to have his birthday, and so he says, as he gives Jake this magic rock and says that it is a magic rock, and we have Jake, who's supposed to really hold on to this rock, and come to find out when, of course, Chris is to kind of wave his hands over Jake's hands, we all of a sudden find that this rock turns into a lizard. So Liz asks about Chris being a magician, and he, of course, mentions that he had a gig in Vegas where he goes by the name of Frank Cadillac. And then he goes on to explain what I've already explained about the whole Frankenstein Cadillac thing. So, Callie is shooting targets at this target range, and Kavanaugh has ID'd both Chris and Liz from this footage. So, Chris drives as Liz is starting to fall asleep. She then wakes up and is like, "Oh, I didn't drool, did I?" And Chris is like, No, you're perfectly fine." So, Liz talks about the weather, and we have, of course, Chris that goes into this story about at one point there was raining fish, which makes no sense. But at some point it was like the weirdest but interesting story. So we have this construction worker that has this road being closed, and so this construction worker talks about like, well, hey, you should go 2 miles back to this hotel. And before this guy could finish, Chris is to say like, yeah, the hotel's name is Cliffhanger. And so the guy's like, okay, like it's weird that that guy finished my story. So they leave and they go back, and even like Liz was kind of baffled by what Chris was to kind of figure things out. So Callie and Kavanaugh look at the footage and track down the permit that Liz has on her car. So when Chris and Liz get to the hotel, Liz asks where they will be sleeping, and Chris is like, well, like, I'm obviously going to sleep in the car. Like, you can go on and have this room. It'll be perfectly fine. And, like, even more so, Liz is just kind of like, man, this guy is so nice, like, absurdly so. So, we have Chris that goes on and makes this kind of weird hot dog joke, and then he leaves. So, Liz looks out the window at Chris sleeping in the car, and then she just kind of closes the blinds of the window. So, Callie had Kavanaugh tell her about the construction worker who saw Chris. So, Wisdom tells his agents that they're on an alert, and one of the agents is to mention that like they should just kind of wait and see what the villain side will do before they try and do anything. And Callie is like, well, that's great and all for you to just kind of play your wait and see game, but I would rather go on and quickly try and locate Chris Johnson. So we have one of the men who is working for Mr. Smith that is to call them and let them know that the authorities are deploying, and Mr. Smith will have the police find Chris for them. So Liz asks where her and Chris should eat, and Chris tells a story about a painter that makes a rose. Chris tells a story about a painter that talks about like beauty and everything like that, as Liz is just kind of having this towel and nothing else. So Chris has a rose that appears from burning some paper, and Chris, from him seeing things in the future, is to have kissed Liz already, and he states that kissing her was incredible, but Liz is kind of baffled and confused what Chris is talking about, and so they kiss again, now in the real part of the film. So Callie and Kavanaugh are in the helicopter figuring out strategies to get to Chris. We come to find out that there was a dead woman near their office that was found, and her throat was sliced just like Roybal was before. And I didn't go on and state that, but yeah, like when the guy was talking to Mr. Smith, like yeah, there was a woman that was just kind of dead in this room, but I didn't bring that up. So while Chris and Liz are in bed, because I guess they did some humping after they did some loving, some kissing. So Liz is to mention there might be something as much as destiny, and so Liz leaves, and Callie talks to Liz about Chris while the bad guys look on to see what they're doing. So Callie tells Liz that Chris is delusional and used Liz to get away from the agents, And so Liz is like, oh my god. So Kavanaugh wants Liz to drug Chris, and Callie convinces her that they're working on the same team. They're working on the same side. So Chris notices something like kind of off about Liz after she comes back from her walk, but she convinces him to get ready for breakfast, that they're gonna do something, that she's probably gonna make breakfast herself. So Callie and Liz look at their watches to determine, like, okay, like, Chris can only see past 2 minutes, so, like, do this drug thing in this OJ at this time. So Liz tells Chris the truth about the drug and convinces him to not drink the orange juice. And so Chris doesn't. And so we have Liz that tells Chris if he goes on and tries to escape, they might shoot him and try to kill him. It's like, dude, Chris can avoid and dodge everything. He's been shot at plenty of times the further and further we get into this film, so he can dodge a wrench and dodge a ball and dodge whatever he needs to continue to survive. So we have Liz who is to desperately ask Chris, like, is all of this true? Like, are you really to be the man that they say that you are? And so Chris turns the volume up on the TV as Callie wants the sound taken out so that way they can hear what's going on. So Chris asks how long the drug should take effect, and we have Liz who's like, well, I'm not quite sure, like maybe 5 minutes. So Chris takes the non-drugged orange juice and goes outside and drinks it and then comes back inside. And Chris explains the guy he tackled at the casino was going to rob and kill people, and it didn't happen because Chris prevented it. So Chris uses the TV to show Liz that he can see through the future. He starts flipping through all these channels, and we have Chris stating exactly what the people say. And so we have Liz that doesn't exactly feel 100% convinced, and is like, well, hey, is this some kind of trick? And Chris is like, I don't have time to try and keep explaining this to you. But so we also have Chris that admits like he was born this way. He didn't just get it when he was like 18 or something like that. So Chris re-explains his ability and so Liz is to... Let me pause here for a second. Alright, the reason why I needed to pause for a second here was like I was to kind of get some things kind of scrambled here. So Chris is to like re-explain his abilities that he can see like 2 minutes ahead of time, but with Liz it seems that he can see even more, but he doesn't want the authorities to know that, because then they'll use possibly Liz against Chris. But so we also have Liz that is possibly thinking that this whole time that they had met and fallen in love, that Chris was using his ability as one big massive setup. So this to me, let's kind of pause this right here. And this to me kind of sounds almost similar to like the Groundhog's Day, when Bill Murray's character goes after the person that he's trying to fall in love with, he tries to go on and like do this kind of like snowman thing, but then when he tries to consistently like repeat the day, he then realizes that there's certain things that he can't recreate, and it just comes off as very phony, and the girl starts to realize it. It's like, hey, like, you tripped and fell and that just looked weird. And like, it was all about him trying to recreate that same moment, but it just comes off as phony. And so by the end of it, we start to have the woman that realizes, like, well, hey, like, you know every single thing about me, like, to a T, and like as if you called friends of mine and so on and so yeah, so like it really started to become that uh the whole perfect date thing was never really going to happen, and so Bill's character kind of gives up on that, but at some point he wins over the girl at the end anyways, by kind of uh perfecting to save like everyone in this town, and then going up into being bidded on by all these women in this town. So anyways, pushing on. So Chris tells her it wasn't a setup, and so Liz wants to know what the authorities want from him, and Chris mentions that it's a matter of national security and that he can't actually help them in the way that they want. So we have Chris that gives Liz this note and tells her that after she leaves, that he wants her to read this note and do what he told her, and then Chris leaves. But also Chris to tell Liv, it's like, well, hey, if you can wait, like it might take like a week or a month or a year, uh, but I will find you. So Liz, after Chris leaves, reads the note, and Callie tells Chris not to escape, and Chris tells her that he already has. So Chris jumps off this cliff, and so there's kind of people running behind him, and so Chris dodges a bullet that is shot to try and kill him. Liz crashes her car into a water tower. We have a car and a train and other things that go flying down this cliff, as like barrels and all kinds of things, as Chris is to dodge the car, but just kind of like ducking into one position and then comes back like, all right, like let's keep running. So we have Chris that meets up with Callie, and she has a gun to him, and Chris is like, are you really gonna try and shoot me here? Like, you need me, so why are you putting a gun on me? It seems kind of a waste. And so we start to hear the rumblings of things that are kind of rolling down the cliff, and Callie's like, well, hey, like, you're gonna want to protect me because you're a good person, so yeah, so Chris does go on and grab Callie and perfectly align her to where she will not get crushed, or neither will him, as we have this car that falls on top of them, protecting them, and these pieces of lumber start to roll and again start to protect them even more. So we again have Callie that after both Chris and Callie get out of this kind of rubble, we again have Callie that feeds Chris the line of like, well, hey, no good deed goes unpunished, right? So we then transition to have Chris, who is in this room where his eyes are kind kind of stayed open with this machine. And so he's looking at this TV. And so Callie is forcing him to stretch his ability as he's watching this news coverage. So we have Chris that tries and stretches his ability, and he is to see this news coverage about a woman in a wheelchair with a bomb strapped to her chest. And we find out that is Liz. Chris apologizes to Liz for what he had gone and done, and Callie is confused, and Liz blows up on television. And so the news reporter is kind of like lost for words, and she's like, oh my god, So Chris is to go on and tell Callie, it's like, well, hey, like, I'll do whatever you want, just get me out of this, like, headgear, like, just get me out of this room, like, I'll do whatever you need me to do. And so Callie's like, oh, okay, alright, like, we've broken him. So Chris goes into this room, and he's talking to these soldiers, and so he asks them for a smoke, and he asks them for a light, and they're like, are you serious? Like, we're gonna give you a lighter? No. So what Chris does is he takes this cigarette and makes it disappear, and then he kicks these soldiers, and then he runs out of this place and tries to escape. So we have all the agents that are scrambling after Chris. Like, this is to be an on-foot endeavor. So Chris is just kind of running onto the street, and we even have a helicopter that is kind of following where he's going. So Chris makes his way to this parking garage, and this is the same place where Liz had died when Chris had tried to look into the future. So Chris explains that Liz's death happens 2 hours from now, and Callie knows who has her and knows they're using Liz as bait. And so Callie wants them to help one another, to work together, and let the bad guys actually shoot Chris, as we know that when Chris is to kind of walk into this parking garage, there might be someone that is to think it's like, oh, we need to take out Chris. So we have Chris that goes out to this parking garage, and so Mr. Jones goes on to shoot Chris, and so Chris falls over. We have Jones, who is to try to make a call stating that the hit, like, that he had killed Chris. And so what happens is this helicopter flies by with all these men to shoot Jones down. And so what happened is that Callie had killed, like, all of the, like, the phone services to have Jones not be able to make the call. So we have Callie that goes on and checks on Chris, and Chris is fine. So as she stated that it's like, man, that was pretty close. So we have Chris that states like, well, yeah, but like no matter what I do, like Liz still dies here. So like we need to figure something out. So Chris is to try and look into this location and is to try and see the license plate of the van that drops off Liz with this bomb strapped to her. So Chris is to rattle off the license plate to Liz or Callie, I mean. And so Callie repeats this on to the agents who are looking for this license plate. So we have Liz, who ends up getting taken, and she ends up getting put into this van while Chris and Callie are making a plan as others are trying to butt into this whole strategy of things. And Chris is to say to them, it's like, well, hey, like, you guys need to listen to me. Like, I'm going to go on and save all of you. Like, what I can tell you can save your life, so you need to listen to me. So we have them all kind of come into this area, and like they have like their whole shootout like situation here. So we have a helicopter that shoots down a helicopter. We have Chris that tells them when to shoot. That the van that Liz is in ends up falling over because when Chris is telling them exactly when to shoot. So we have Liz that tries to escape from this van, and Chris tells the police about the guy that's in the crane, and it kind of put the shot at a certain angle as Callie is to take the shot because the other guy couldn't trust making that shot. So Liz tries to get her vest off, and Chris tells the guys like where to turn, where to go, and that like there are certain places that will be safe and so on and so forth. So Smith grabs Liz. Mr. Smith grabs Liz, and so Chris's team follows Smith and Liz and the rest of his team, Mr. Smith's team, that are making their way onto this boat. So Chris tells the team about an explosive that Mr. Smith's team had planted, and so they deactivate the bomb. So Chris knows the location of explosives and tells the team to kind of just stay close. So the further and further they walk, Chris gets shot, and so Chris then is to reverse back in time. And so Chris tells the team about a sniper, and so they end up figuring out where exactly this guy is, and they shoot him and they kill him. So we have Chris and we have Callie's team that end up having to separate, because we have Chris that is to take it upon himself to go through every part of this boat to figure out where both Smith and Liz are, while this one team is to go into one direction, and that ends up costing them while they were to get kind of ambushed by one of Smith's people, this woman. We end up having Kavanaugh that dies in the process. So Chris at one point was to make his way to cross this bridge, and it explodes and he falls to his death. So Chris, realizing that, ends up taking himself, kind of splitting it into going another direction. So Liz, come to find out, Chris finds that she's in the engine room. So Chris goes all the way back to tell Callie and her team before they go onto that mission to where Kavanaugh dies. We have Chris that tells Callie that like they're in the engine room. So Chris talks to Smith, and Chris dodges every shot that Chris is to fire upon him. And Chris had gone on to ask Callie, it's like, well, how good are you with that gun? And Callie's like, I'm pretty good. So Smith takes uh, the detonator out instead of the gun, and Callie shoots the detonator and then shoots Chris in the head, and like Chris goes on to tell like Smith is like, well, man, you made a stupid decision. So Chris is to convince Liz it's over, but Callie is like, well, no, it's really not actually over. So Chris is like, well, what do we have left? So they have to figure out where the bomb is because the bomb is still in play. So Chris is to go on and try to figure out where the bomb is, and he realizes that he had made a mistake and that the bomb is still going to go off, and it's going to go off soon. And so when Chris tries to protect Liz from this detonation, like it wipes out all of this area, all this country. So we then backpedal all the way back to when Chris was with Liz in their bed together, and they had just slept together. And so Chris gets out of bed and he makes a call to Callie, and he tells her, it's like, well, hey, like, I'm willing to work with you guys as long as Liz is safe. And so Chris goes on and is to talk to Liz and tell her, it's like, well, hey, like, I've been putting something off for some time now, and that he can't put it off anymore. And that he also says again, it's like, well, hey, like, you might have to wait, like, if you're willing to wait like a week, a month, a year, like, I will find you. So Chris again is to kind of wait for Callie, and so he again starts talking about the future, and that looking into the future and that looking into the future can change everything, and the stuff that he said, like, kind of in the early part of the movie. So Chris and Callie meet, and she gets out of her car, and so Callie tells Chris, is like, well, hey, are you ready? And they get in the car together and they leave, and that's how they end the movie. So with that said, I'm just gonna get out of here. My apologies. Like, I was just kind of like blah blah blah. Man, I was trying to just crank out this thing, and then I was like blah. Like, I really could not. Like, there was a lot of just stuff there where I was like, man, there's a lot of in this movie. So the further and further of which that I have to kind of talk about this and try to get it out as quickly as possible, the more I was realizing that I was like, man, I'm making a lot of mistakes. But with that said, I'm just going to get out of here. Let me know in the comments below how you felt about next. So with that said, I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.